Hello, and welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show, a podcast to help you unlock tremendous growth for your app. My name is Shamant Rao. I'm the CEO of the boutique growth marketing firm Rocketship HQ and host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show. In each episode, we feature experts in the field of mobile growth and discuss strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing. By the end of each episode, you will have gained actionable and tactical insights that will help you make more informed decisions in your own work around growth. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is produced by Meryl Vincent, Content Marketing Manager at Rocketship HQ.
Our guests today are Liliya Gafitulina, UA Manager in charge of all ad networks, and Bogdan Khashiev, UA Manager in charge of social media traffic at AdQuantum. In today's episode, we dive deep into the creative strategy that underpins some of the significantly scaled casual games owned by AdQuantum, as Liliya and Bogdan pull back the curtains on what works for their highly scaled games. We talk about user motivations that inform creative strategy. We dive deep into misleading ads, why they work, and how adapting the onboarding and product experiences can unlock dramatic growth. Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Today, we have a special episode with two guests. Our guests today are Liliya Gafitulina and Bogdan Khashiev from AdQuantum. I'm excited to have them because they are very much at the leading edge of marketing for games, for casual games. And as we all know, it's become ever more hairy after iOS 14 and SCAN. These guys have gone very deep into understanding how to manage creatives, how to do high velocity creative testing, how to even qualitatively understand creatives, and how to really drive growth for games post-ATT. For all of these reasons, I'm excited to have Liliya and Bogdan on the show. Liliya, Bogdan, welcome to the show.
Hey.
Yeah. To start off, when you're first producing creatives for a game, where do you begin? How do you begin to understand what your creative strategy needs to be?
So first of all, we need to play a game and understand the core mechanics, setting, and graphic elements. After that, we make core gameplay creatives, like, for example, screencast, in order to attract the most relevant users. And after we understand how do they perform within the testing sources and understand which exact game element or setting element attracts the users the most, we start to add some maybe meta misleading features. So for example, storytelling before the core gameplay or exaggerating mechanics or something like that. At this point, we can set certain boundaries for what we consider meta misleads and what we consider misleads.
So you start with the core gameplay and then you say, hey, can we figure out, what kind of misleading ads can we add and test? Certainly that's been a big topic of conversation in gaming lately, and we'll definitely want to get into that into more detail. Ads based on core gameplay. Are you using any sort of user motivation models? Facebook certainly popularized that with their Big Catch playbook, but certainly within the field of game design, there have been many other user motivation models, which we've actually talked about on the show before. But do you use these models to understand what the core gameplay creatives need to be? How do you think about that?
Let me say that we try to use different models because, as you know, there are different approaches how you divide users into different categories. The one thing I would like to emphasize is that we always first focus on the creative mechanics as the key element of the creative process. So we first look at what our game can offer as a game mechanic itself, and then how we can, implement this mechanic into the creative and make it a creative mechanic. And then if it works, we start to analyze what type of users it probably attracts. We can never be sure, 100% sure, but we we have experience and we have some knowledge about what type of mechanics attracts different users. And this is actually up to our creative team. We have a special team that is, deeply thinking into these creative mechanics, and they actually are free to use any models that they would like to use, as long as it provides the progression of the development of the mechanic. That the next iteration of the creative will be somehow developing the concept that we're using at the moment. And we like to build the creative map, that when we first find something that works, something with high CTR and adequate install rate, we then try to make some variants, make some iterations. And then we kind of put it on a map where we can see what we change and how it changed the metrics. And the key elements of this process is for the UA team and creative team to communicate with each other, and for us to provide them with metrics, for us to build them the map of numbers. Because we're deep into the numbers of the creatives, so we know how they perform at the top of the funnel and at the bottom of the funnel. And it's up to the creative team to tell us and to explain us what they have in mind and what type of users they're trying to attract. And that's how we build this complex experience of both creative and UA team. So when we use creatives, we try to think about the users we're buying, that we're targeting. But speaking about the models, my creative team shared me with their most commonly used model, and it consists of, I believe it's 6 categories, and they are divided by the need, or as you say, the pain that the user is looking for in game, and consequently in creative. So they are divided by these needs, and these are communication, mastership, management, self-expression, researching, and escapism. And these categories are also divided into subgroups, but this is like the deeper part of it.
Yeah, and definitely multiple models, right? And a lot of these are originate in game design, so certainly it makes sense to use what works for you guys as games. And are there examples of how creators might map to some of these models? Are there some examples that come to mind that you might want to share?
As we shared, I think we shared with you previously, we shared some creatives from Golden Goblins. It's our creatives. At that point, when we used these creatives, it was, I believe, 1 year ago after we found the concepts, and then it was completely burned out. Up to now, it's completely out of use because we spent too much on them. Later, we tried to think what type of users we attracted with these creatives and what we probably should not use anymore, because, as I said, because of the enormous cost that we spent on these creatives. Yeah, this was management as we saw it, because, as you know, these are popular creatives when you need to merge different warriors and towers and then match it with the warriors on the other tower, so that the number of your warrior will defeat the number of their warriors. Yeah, it's kind of a management creative, for example. Now as for now, we use for Lumber, other game that we are promoting at the moment, and one of them, you probably also saw it. It's a huge combine collecting trees and then upgrading the factory. It's also management, so the audience is kind of similar to each other, but the creative approach is different. That is due to the core mechanic that we use from game, this collecting woos and producing factories, and then that we put into the creative. So as I said, we first try to be mechanic oriented, and then we try to use these models to describe what we are looking at, and then
Sure.
how we can develop it, maybe find something else that works. Actually, the towers that I mentioned, they also worked for Lumber for a decent period of time, because we realized
Sure.
that probably the same audience, and we can, the different segments of this audience can be targeted with different creatives of the same type. Yeah.
No, thank you for those examples. That all makes sense. And I know, Liliya, you had said earlier about starting with the core ads and then transitioning into misleading creatives. When does that happen? Are there like trigger points in a game's life cycle when that happens? And is there a process by which you understand, which ones are we going to test? How do we test these? Can you talk a bit more about that process?
So yeah, of course, we start to create meta-misleading and misleading creatives, of course, after we see that all the core creatives, all the screencasts are burned out. Then we start with meta-misleading ones by adding some, misleading elements to the core gameplay. I guess we also shared some examples with you. And we see that meta-misleading and misleading mechanics may work well with the audience that prefer to watch ads instead of playing in the game. So for some casual projects, this meta-misleading and misleading stage comes rather quickly. But of course, we first of all test the core mechanic gameplays. After we understand which meta-misleading mechanics are the most appealing to the users, we start to develop them further and find new ones. And in the best case scenario, we use misleads only at the point when we run out of any meta-misleading and core gameplay creative ideas, because such, of course, may drop the short-term retention rate. And for mid and hardcore games, we tend not to use at all, because here it is important to show the end product to the user. But we also may add some meta-misleading mechanics like storytelling, for example, before showing the core gameplay.
Sure. Can you define for folks who do not know what's meta-misleading and what's misleading?
Sure. So misleading creative is the creative that consists of some totally misleading mechanics and graphics maybe, and maybe even characters.
Give examples maybe. Yeah, for both, if you can give examples. Go ahead.
So I actually can give the same example of the towers, because, for example, there were no towers in the Golden Goal game, and the setting was totally different with these creatives. So it differs from the game one. So these types we consider to be misleading. And for meta-misleading, we show the lumber crate, for example, where the mechanic itself is exaggerated. So for example, in the game itself, you don't have this big tractor that collects all the woods, but still the mechanic remains the same and the characters remain the same and the setting remains the same. So only some certain elements are misleading for this creative, but all in all, it is related to the game.
Yeah. So meta-misleading is, sorry, Bogdan. So I understand meta-misleading is you take the mechanic in the game, but it's exaggerated. Misleading is, misleading is it's not even present in the game.
Yeah, it may be not even presented in the game, or it may be in the different setting, different visual graphic elements or something like that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bogdan.
Yeah, and we had a debate about the the towers and how they should be defined as a meta-misleading or as a misleading creative, because the mechanic of the one part of these towers is to merge some units into a bigger amount, and that is actually what is present in the game. It's present in Golden Goblins, and that's is a key element of the game. But there was a debate with our colleagues. I think it's still ongoing. Like we still can sometimes argue about that. Yeah, but overall, we think it's more misleading because it's just a little part of the creative, the merging, but the matching numbers to and this primitive math that we use and the antagonism of these like two towers is we believe that this is the key elements of the creative, of the tower type creative, and that is something not present in the game. It's not something you use to. That is not something that we use as a core mechanic of the game. That's why we define this as a more towards mislead. But it's like a percentage. It's
Sure.
Surely more misleading, but still in some way it's meta misleading.
Sure. Yeah. And Liliya, I know you very briefly said, look, the misleading ads don't usually work for strategy and mid-core games because you want the game to be very faithful to what's in the ad.
Yes.
So with casual games, why is that not a problem? So in other words, right? So if the user sees a misleading or even a meta misleading ad, they go to the game, they don't see the feature in the game. Is there a risk for casual games that your retention might be poor or your long-term LTV might be poor just because they don't see the ad contents within the game?
There is a risk, but still these users sometimes pay off much quicker than the long-term LTV drops. So for example, in casual games, we have many ad watchers who prefer to watch ads, and they may be triggered by those meta misleading or misleading ads and pay off quicker than bad
Sure.
things happen. So yeah, when we use them mainly with the games where the really long-term retention rates and LTVs are not that important, when it is more important to pay off rather quickly.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense because you just need them to stick around for a very short payback period.
Yes.
That's what matters, right? Yeah. And and obviously there are games that do change the App Store screenshots and
Yes.
of course the game itself based
Yes.
on what's working in the fake ads. And what does that process look like for you guys?
So yes, sometimes we this practice because it shows good results in terms of retention rate and conversion rate from page view into installs. We sometimes, as only 40% of ASO elements should reflect the core gameplay, we have room to experiment here. So for example, we can add some meta misleading asset, for example, some non-existing mechanic, but with our characters and in our settings, or a screenshot of top performing mislead or meta mislead creative, but with real interface, for example. We don't actually use very misleading assets with the ASO, but still we have a room for experiments here. We also test icons, for example, when we change the character or maybe the most favorite asset that appeals the more for the users in order to check which one will appeal the most to the user. What we don't do, we actually do not use misleading videos in the ASO because so when the user see this page in the store, they should see the end product itself.
Mm-hmm.
But with other assets, it is possible, yes, to use meta misleads.
Yeah. And does that mirroring of misleads happen within the game as well, within the onboarding, within the early levels, later levels? Is that something you guys plan? How do you guys think about that?
So basically, with long-term perspective, we believe that, first of all, we can, by those meta misleading mechanics, check if some new feature will be appealing to the user. So for example, we can add a screenshot of still non-existing level with the CTA like coming soon, for example, and check if it is appealing to the user and add it into the game later. So it works this way also.
Sure. And other examples that come to mind? Go ahead, sir, please.
Yeah, the very first example that comes to mind is Golden Goblins. As we previously mentioned, the tower creatives. At some point, they were added to the ASO as screenshots. I believe that the developers and the production team were even considering adding some sort of level of the same type, but that never happened. Probably because the creatives, they eventually burn out, and then they thought that was no good to the game itself. And then later, when we found a different approach, we switched the ISO icons, the ISO screenshots to, the screenshots from the creatives that we use, that we still use. This is the approach with, once again, the combine, but they're collecting the rocks. So once again, the exaggerated mechanics of what you should do in the game. Yeah, that's probably the case.
Sure. And I know, Lily, I think you mentioned earlier about even if the long-term value is not there, let's just say you haven't changed the ASO, you haven't changed the product, just have an ad, then you can get a very quick payoff if they're ad monetizing. Now, what happens if the monetization model of the game is IAP driven or hybrid, where you need to make money back over a long period of time? In those cases, are misleading ads as effective, or is that not quite the case?
So basically, most of all casual games are both in-app ads and in-app purchase monetized. So we still see pretty good results with meta misleading and misleading creatives, because sometimes it happens so that the meta misleading or misleading mechanic is catchy for the user, and after they start playing the game, they really evolve. They really evolve into the process and still remain there and still make purchases and still watch ads, so they still pay off.
I should add that for UA team, it's very important to know the in-app and in-app rate, the in-app IAP and IAA ratio. So the ratio between ad monetization and purchase monetization, you should know it at the supposed level and both at the current level. So the communication with the production team is very important. How new changes affects this ratio. So the one thing that we should keep in mind for for monetization is the eCPM decay, as you all probably know, but I should still elaborate on that. The eCPM decay is a thing that when each ad watched by the same user from the first one gives you less revenue, costs less. And having this in mind, such metrics as retention rate and probably conversion rates, they become less important. So they become less important due to in comparison with the low CPI that you should aim for when you're targeting for these ad nerds, these ad watchers, because you need them to be quickly monetized. Yeah, that's probably the main difference between these mixed and more ad monetization models.
Sure. All of that makes sense. To also switch gears a bit, can you describe your testing process, right? So, completely new, some folks test completely new creatives in tier 3 geos, then they move to Western Europe, then they move to US. So what does your testing process look like? What KPIs are you looking for? How does this differ for different channels that you guys may be using?
Okay, so I should probably start with social networks because we use them as the first step of testing creatives. Basically, there are two main considerations that you should keep in mind. The first one is the relevance of your test. You obviously need to get enough data, enough impressions, and respectively enough clicks to measure your CPI so that the results that you acquire are trustworthy. But the second one is the cheapness of your test. For example, in AdQuantum, we run up to 30 creatives within the same test, sometimes for some projects. So you need to be wise how you spend your cost, because otherwise the test can be way too expensive. So your test settings come from the compromise of these two factors. My personal recommendations and what we use with in most of our projects is to choose some cheap, in terms of CPM, cheap geo like Brazil. Brazil is one of my favorite one, and use the the relevant optimization. For example, purchases. So purchases Brazil is one of the best setting to test your creative. You obviously should test them at the same time, so at the same campaign. And I also have a recommendation that you should stick to the chosen setting as long as possible, so you can retrospectively compare which creatives shown the metrics of the creative that you tested before, and also use such metrics as IPM, impression per millennium. It's a very useful metric to measure the, I'm probably sure that most of our listeners are familiar with this metrics, but still it's a very useful metric that is not affected by the CPM whatsoever. It just shows how effective your creative is from the point of attractiveness. Yeah, and we also use the so-called day one player cost when we divide the CPI by retention rate. So then we get the cost of player who stick to the game with the game on day one. That's how we combine the retention rate and CPI together within one metric. Yeah.
Sure.
On ad networks, we tend to use those creatives who pass the social network test because it is much more expensive to test on social networks. And sometimes it is impossible because we, for example, may produce 20 to 30 new creatives for a title per week. And it is too much for an ad network to proceed.
Yeah.
So we take into consideration that what works well on social networks might work well on other traffic sources and use these creatives. And of course, sometimes we also run internal tests on ad networks, but they are mostly referred to end cards, to playables, playable-like end cards, and so on, because it's not applicable for social networks.
Sure. And out of curiosity, did your approach very different on TikTok, if that is something you guys run extensively?
No, as far as I know, my colleagues who works on TikTok, they use the same test setting as we use on different social networks. It's basically Brazil that we use for testing. And from my experience, most of the results that you test within different social networks are very much comparable from one network to another. If your creative shows some decent metrics on one social network, you can be probably 95% sure that it will be as effective, as efficient within the other network. Yeah.
No, that all makes sense, you guys. Yeah, I think this is perhaps a good place for us to wrap up. Thank you so much, Liliya and Bogdan. But before we wrap up, can you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you guys do?
Our listeners can visit our website at AdQuantum.com, I believe. It has all the information about how we perform within our profession and what we can offer as an agency. And also, we'll send you the link, so maybe you can attach it to the information. Yeah.
Also, you can see all our cases on our website. They are published. So
certainly. And we will also link to your LinkedIn, Liliya and Bogdan. So if folks want to connect with you, they can do so. But for now, I think this is a good place to wrap. Thank you so much for being on the Mobile User Acquisition Show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.